great pleasure to have Marwan Muasher with us. I was noticing the title, The Arab Awakening, 1 year later. And last year I heard there's a big controversy over these titles. Whether it should be the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening, and I couldn't believe the discussion that took place. Awakening means you're in slumber, spring means there's hope, all these other things. But nevertheless, Muasher will help us to sort that through. Just a little bit of background on Dr. Muasher. He is currently Vice President at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C. And he coordinates research both in Washington and in Beirut. Also, Beirut, Carnegie has a center located in Beirut. And he began his career in diplomacy almost accidentally. I heard him talk to me. We had a meeting with Father Peter before we came here, so I learned a lot about him from there, which I'm happy to share. He has a PhD from Purdue University in engineering. So, as they say, everybody in the Middle East is either an engineer or a doctor. Those are the two professions that everybody was I thought lawyers were also in there, but he assured me that that's not the case. Lawyers were not looked upon as an excellent profession to be in. So it's either Mohandas or Tabib, right? Okay. So he began his political career as a journalist, and it reminds me of Dr. Malik here also was a journalist when he began his career before an academic, and so he caught the attention of the governments, various governments in Jordan, and he was very critical, he says, of the various governments, and finally a government that was in the opposition came to power and decided to employ him as a spokesperson, and then he served in the Ministry of Planning and the Prime Minister's office as a press officer and as director of Jordan Information Bureau in Washington, D.C. And then with the peace process that began in the early 90s, he was appointed by King Hussein as the first Jordanian ambassador to Israel. And this was he may speak about that, but it was certainly an important office that he assumed as a patriot, as an Arab, and as a Jordanian. And then he was there for about a year when he again became involved with the government in Jordan, became Minister of Information, and again a spokesperson for the government. And then from 1997 to 2002, he came to Washington, where he was Jordan's ambassador, negotiating a free trade agreement between the United States and an Arab nation, I believe, that Arab nation of Jordan. Right? And so then he went back to Jordan, became foreign minister in Jordan between 2002 and 2004, and then deputy prime minister in 2004 2005. And then came back to Washington, where he joined the Carnegie Institute. And so it is a great pleasure to have Dr. Muasher here. We tried to get him last year. He had a very, very heavy schedule. He was lecturing at Harvard and other institutions. He'll tell you all about them, I'm sure. But he did put Villanova on his list, and also thanks to a relative of his, Rania, who I asked to call him and make sure that he would come to Villanova, and he did. So again, thank you, and Dr. Muasher, we turn it over to you. Thank you.
I don't know. Maybe I'll yeah. I don't know what to do with my hands, so that's why. But Father Ellis, Professor Credia, thank you very much for having me here at Villanova, Professor. I'm here to talk about what I call the Arab Awakening. I'll tell you why I call it the Arab Awakening and not yet an Arab Spring in a while. But I try, when I talk about this, not to go through basically what will happen tomorrow morning in each Arab country. I think you've all been saturated with news items and articles about predictions about what will happen. But rather than doing that, although I'm happy to do it if you want me to in the question and answer session, I tried to actually take a sort of a longer term view of what is going on in the region and where I see the region going from there. When I do that, I'm reminded by a famous saying by Winston Churchill, who used to say, diplomats are people who can predict what will happen tomorrow. And then when tomorrow comes, explain why it did not happen. So with that caveat, I'll try to predict what will happen tomorrow. But don't hold me to it. I shy away from calling it an Arab Spring because, as Father Ellis said, an Arab Spring suggests a romantic notion that we are going to see a transformation almost overnight from autocratic governments to democratic ones, simply because of the overthrow of a dictator. That, of course, is not the case, neither in the Middle East nor anywhere else in the world. Transformations take time, and particularly in our region of the world that has not witnessed a strong civil society culture, a strong political party culture, it is rather unrealistic to predict, to hope that the country is going to simply bloom into a democracy just because Mubarak was ousted from power, or Ben Ali, or some of the other leaders. Having said that, of course, is not an excuse for the status quo being static. I'm a firm believer in the process of change. I'm a firm believer in the need for reform in the Middle East. And I think the question that many people have asked today is not why this has taken place, but why it has waited that long before it took place, when every other region of the world, every single one, has moved on governance except the Middle East until recently. Whether you look at Latin America or Eastern Europe or Sub-Saharan Africa or Southeastern Asia, every single region has witnessed a move towards democracy in the last 40 years, except the Arab world, which has been very, very resilient until the events of last year. But I like to remind people that this is not the first awakening that the region has witnessed. For those of you in history, you might know about a famous book called The Arab Awakening, which was written by a guy whose name does not sound Arabic, and yet he actually exemplifies all the diversity that exists in the Arab world today. George Antonius, a guy of Lebanese parents, born in Alexandria, Egypt, who made Palestine his home. An Arab, a Christian, exemplifying all the diversity that like I said, that exists in the Arab world today. He wrote about an Arab awakening, an awakening at the time in 1938 where Arabs were getting rid of Ottoman rule first and then of colonial rule, Western rule later on. But the awakening that he wrote about failed miserably. Did not fail in getting Arabs rid of Ottoman rule or colonial rule, but failed in what happened later on. Failed in developing pluralistic societies in the Arab world. And so what ended up happening is the replacement of one autocratic form of government by another. This time, we must not allow that to happen again. A second Arab awakening, if it is to be successful, must end even through a process that will be bumpy and long and turbulent, must end in pluralistic societies if it is to be successful. And that's my main theme throughout. The Arab world today, in my view, can be divided into two groups of countries. countries that have some time left on their clock and countries whose time is up. In countries whose time is up, people said enough is enough. We cannot take this low level of governance for much longer. And if you guys are not going to do something about it, we are. And basically, these are the countries that have surrendered the pace of reform to the street. The street is great at starting change. It is never great at institutionalizing it. And in countries like Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and others, basically the process now is in the hand of the street. In places like Tunisia, it is going through a rather smooth transition. In places like Syria or Libya or even Egypt, the transition is much less smoother. But the other group of countries, those that have time on their hand, either because their systems are more legitimate or because historically they were more open than other countries, or because they have money, frankly. And these are countries that, ironically, most of them are monarchies, whether it is the rich monarchies in the Gulf or the poor monarchies in Morocco and Jordan. Are these people using the time wisely to put in place a reform process, be ahead of the street, and ensure that in implementing a reform process from above, they are not going to witness the shocks that the other Arab countries are witnessing? Are they being wise? That's the big question to ask. The rich countries of the Gulf are using their money basically so far to buy time. And money can buy time, but not forever. And the poor Arab countries, Morocco and Jordan, are doing some reforms. Are they enough? I don't think so. Are they enough to keep them ahead of the street? I don't think so. Morocco is certainly so far doing better than Jordan is. But in both countries, being ahead of the street is going to mean not just ad hoc reforms here and there, but it's going to mean a sustained process that ends up with power sharing. Any process of change in the Arab world or elsewhere that does not end up in power sharing is a process that will not be successful. And what I mean by power sharing is a process that will take power, some power, not all of it of course, away from an executive that has been very dominant in the Arab world towards the legislative and judicial branches of government. In every Arab country, parliaments are subservient to the executive, and the judicial process is less than independent. That's not a system that can, develop a system of checks and balances where no power, no authority can be dominant over any other authority. That's the main challenge that we face in the Arab world. And so far, few countries are rising up to it. And that, frankly, is what worries me most. Whether we are worried about Egypt or Syria or Yemen, frankly, at this point is irrelevant because they're going through the process. But where we can affect the process in a positive way is in countries that have not yet witnessed the same turbulence, the same upheaval that these countries have. And whether we are doing so as citizens, as the international community, is an open question. That's the first thought I want to leave you with. The second thought is that this is obviously a process that will take decades. This is not a process that can be judged in months, weeks, or years. And if you allow yourself to judge the process in such terms, you are going to get many heartburns, many of them. If you open the paper every day and see what is happening in Egypt, what is happening in Syria, you are going to say this is an Arab world that is headed to disaster. I don't see it this way. I don't judge the process in months and years. This is a process that will take decades. And it is totally understandable, in my view, that societies that have not witnessed pluralism are not going to know how to do it overnight. They're going to commit many political and economic mistakes, and they are doing so. In the end, though, it is up to all forces in society to work towards, as I said, pluralistic systems if they want their societies to be truly prosperous in the future. This leads me to political Islam. This is after all, what everybody talks about and what many are concerned with. Are we going to witness, 22 Arab Irans in the Middle East? Are we going to witness systems of government that resemble the Iranian system? Because political Islam is coming to power in great strength. Let me first pause and maybe try to inject some I don't know what word to use, some reality checks in what I believe is an overblown threat. First of all, most people, when they think of political Islam in this country, think of Al-Qaeda, maybe Hezbollah and Hamas, because they think of radical organizations that use violent means and that basically are anti-Western. And they are, these groups. But the fact remains that Al-Qaeda, Hamas, and Hezbollah, and they're not the same, by the way, are a tiny, tiny portion of political Islam in the region. The overwhelming majority of political Islam belongs to the Muslim Brotherhood, which started in Egypt and its offshoots in the Arab world. The overwhelming majority. And they might have hardline views on issues, but they are certainly peaceful. They have not carried arms for at least the last half a century. That's the first distinction I want to make. The second one is, yes, most, all, if you want, of these movements have not had a tradition of pluralism, although their positions have moderated across the years a great deal. But please tell me, who among the secular forces in Arab societies have had a tradition of pluralism? Who? Is it Nasserism in Egypt? Is it the Baathists in Syria or Iraq? Is it the Arab nationalists in North Africa? Is it the monarchies in the Gulf? Who among Arab secular forces have had a tradition of pluralism? So when we talk about pluralism, I think we need to hold everybody accountable, not just the Islamists, but everybody, to the same standard of pluralism, of a commitment to peaceful means, and a commitment to a peaceful rotation of power, and a commitment to all forces having the right to politically organize at all times. In my view, political Islam has been strengthened artificially by Arab governments because they have been artificially kept out of the systems. And when they were artificially kept out, while at the same time having closed political systems in all Arab societies, that has meant only one thing. When a citizen is not satisfied with the political establishment, which has grown increasingly unaccountable without a system of checks and balances, where does he or she go and cast a protest vote if the only alternative available to him or her is political Islam? And so over the years, the argument that keeping political Islam outside the system will weaken it has not worked. The historical record clearly shows that political Islam over the last 50 years has been strengthened every day by governments who have refused to open up the political system. And when you are strengthened and don't have to account for your slogans, so Islam is the solution is a great slogan. How does it create jobs? I don't know. And maybe the Islamists know, but they need to prove, just as others do. And the only way to prove that is to be inside the system. But to be kept artificially outside pontificating on how to deal with everyday's problems and not having to being tested on it is a sure formula for success or for popularity. And therefore, the only way to arrive, in my view, at pluralistic societies is to allow everybody in, including the Islamists, and understand that in the short term, these people are going to have an unfair advantage over all others because it's an advantage given to them by Arab governments. And until the field is leveled, and until other political forces rise up, we are going to have to deal with turbulence for some time to come. There is no other way. It is as if somebody is on the top of a burning building and he or she does not want to jump because they don't want to break a leg in the process. Well, I'm sorry, but keeping on the top of the burning building is not an option anymore. You've got to jump. You don't have this option. What you have an option is to make the jump in a way to minimize your sort of chances of getting a leg broken in the process. A lot of people say, fine, this is all good and idealistic talk, but what if political Islam comes to power and then deny others the chance to operate? I don't think this will happen for many reasons. I think we have seen the first and last theocracy in the Middle East in Iran. If there is anything good that the Iranians or the Iranian government has done to the region, it is to show us how not to govern. They have been a disaster at governance. They have presented themselves as people, a system on the side of the oppressed. Well, that's all gone, vanished after Syria. After being on the side of a system that kills 9,000 people of his own, it is difficult for any system to argue that they are on the side of the oppressed. But I also think that the youth in the Arab world, which by the way constitute more than 70% of the population, 70% of the Arab world is under 30 years of age. These are people that will not accept, in my view, the replacement of one autocratic system by another, even if it is a religious one. We have seen that in Egypt. When the secular elements saw that the Muslim Brotherhood was basically in cahoot with the military establishment, they were able to put in the street 1 million people secular, all of them. The time when one form of government, I think, can dictate its terms on the rest of the population, in my own view, is over. However, it's not going to come without a fight. The problem with the secular elements, and I'm one of them, is that they have so far done things from behind a podium, while the Islamists have done things in the street. And if the secular elements who have in the past depended on autocratic regimes to get their lifestyle protected, from now on, if we want our lifestyle to be protected, we've got to fight for it. Gone are the times when we can just lecture or stand by a dictator because that dictator is giving us some rights without us fighting for them. Gone are those times. And from now on, people will have to understand what everybody else in all the democracies do, which is you fight for your rights through organized political activity. You don't fight for your rights through wishing a dictator to give them to you on a silver plate. That's what the problem with the Christians in Syria, in my view. The Christians in Syria today, are standing by Assad because they are afraid that if they don't stand by Assad, any alternative regime is going to go after them. Well, if it's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, if people will look at the Christians as people who don't mind dictators killing 9,000 of their own people just because they want their own lifestyle to be preserved. It's not going to happen this way. And Christians in the Middle East have always been at the forefront of the Renaissance in the region, at the forefront, whether in Lebanon or Syria, in Egypt, in Jordan, and they must remain so, rather than look at themselves as a minority that can only be preserved through the actions of dictators. The real challenge from now on in the Middle East is going to be the economy. Any successful political force is going to live or die by whether they are able from now on to deliver economically to the population. The problem before is that economic reform in the past has acquired a bad name in the Middle East because Arab governments lectured to all of us that we need to put food on the table before we worry about political reform. That this is a luxury, political reform. That when people's stomachs are full, they make better decisions. And what happened? This is the bread before freedom argument. What happened was that in many parts of the Arab world, neither bread nor freedom was attained. And it is because when you implement economic reform without a parallel political reform process that is able to check abuses when they happen institutionally, economic reform has meant in many countries in the Arab world, certainly in places like Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria, that the beneficiaries of such a process have been the elite few around the leader or the regime and not the general public. We have seen this very clearly in Egypt, in Tunisia, and Syria, where very few people even, not layers, people are the beneficiaries of the system. And from now on, it's going to be awfully difficult to convince a very skeptical public that economic reform must take place, because you're not going to be able to solve Egypt's, for example, unemployment issue, except if you do some very difficult economic reform measures. But this time you need to convince your people that this time you're not doing them without a parallel reform, political reform process. That you're developing in parallel a system where abuses will be checked, will be addressed, rather than left unaccounted for, as has been the case so far. All that is going to require a fundamental revisiting of educational systems in the Arab world. Nobody talks about education now. Because when people have economic crisis, the first area to suffer is education. People don't think it is that important of an issue. But if we are to truly develop pluralistic societies in the region, we cannot do this without educating people at a very, very, very early stage what it means to be a citizen, what it means to have rights, what it means to question authority, what it means to not accept everything that is thrown your way as I'm in a Christian university, as gospel. That, that truths are relative and not absolute. That there are always more than one side to a story. That you need to respect, if not always agree, with the right of others to have different points of view. None of that is being taught in our systems. Rather, we spend a lot of time, a lot of energy and money on education, but it is education to put computers in schools. It is education to build schools, to close the gender gap. All are important, but none more important than the values that you instill in people. And in the past, unfortunately, both Arab governments and the religious establishment have basically been in an unwritten alliance not to teach people to criticize their interpretation of the truth, whether that interpretation is secular or religious. And when you do that, instead of developing a docile society, such as was the objective, a docile society that does not question, that does not criticize, the Arab world has developed a very frustrated society, not able to compete in the marketplace, not able to release its full energies and potential, and therefore a society that has ended up with what we are seeing today in the region. Am I optimistic? I don't think in terms of optimism or pessimism as much as I think that it is up to us to define the future of the Arab world. It is up to all the forces in the Arab world. This is not a fight, in my view, of secularism versus Islam. It is not a fight between these two forces that will determine whether the Arab world will be successful or not. It must be a fight for pluralism, where whether you're an Islamist, a liberal, a secular, a conservative, whatever you want to call it, if you do not fight for a system that accepts the right of everybody to be included, you are basically repeating the mistakes of the last 100 years in the Arab world. Will we do this? I don't know. I certainly hope we do. I think that we have, like I said, a youth group, the majority in the Arab world, that so far have proved that they will not accept what their parents accepted, that they are ready to cut across ethnic and religious lines, not every single time, but certainly more than their parents did. And that does give me hope. Their biggest challenge is that they are not organized. And so the benefits of the revolutions that we have seen in the region so far have gone towards the only Islamists, towards the only organized groups, which are the Islamists. But this will change. This will change. I witnessed the elections in Tunisia last October. I was part of an international group that monitored the elections. And guess how many parties contested the elections in Tunisia? 116 parties. One Islamist party and 115 secular parties. So why are we surprised when we see that the 20% that the Islamists commanded on a popular level was translated into 43% representation in parliament? But how many of these 116 parties got seats in parliament? 7. 7. Tunisia is going to have elections in a year and a half, and guess what? they will not have 116 parties contesting elections. They might have 15 parties. And so in my view, frankly, the Islamists, in my view, have witnessed a peak of their support. And their support, which is important, and is between 15 and 20% in Egypt, in Jordan, in Tunisia, in Morocco. So far they have been able to translate that into much greater numbers because of their organized activity. And it's a lesson to everybody else. Everybody needs to be organized and to work for their country's future. Thank you very much.
We now have the opportunity for questions, and we'll start with students. Sorry. Students. All right, we'll start with an older student.
Would you kindly shed some light on Syria? What is going on now? And what do you expect to happen?
Well, let me start with sort of a end result statement. I don't think the Syrian regime can survive. I don't think that any leader can claim any legitimacy after what took place in Syria. So the end result is this regime is going to go. The problem is when and how. Because a revolution that has started as peaceful and remained peaceful for many months is now turning, violent. I mean, justifiably so. People will, if no one else would protect them, they will try to protect themselves. That, of course, means that the reconciliation process after the regime is over is going to be a very, very difficult one, and that we are already seeing sectarian violence in Syria. This is a regime of 10% of the population ruling over the other 90%. So this is a regime that is not interested in reform. Any reform process, however mild, for this regime means that they will be ousted from power. And they have no intention to do so. Unfortunately, they are using every possible means to stay in power, as we have seen. What can we expect? After Libya, the international community is not in a mood to intervene. The Arabs will not intervene militarily, in my opinion. No Arab country likes to see itself as, sort of in a mission to kill other Arabs. Turkey will not intervene without the Arab League. And so I see a number of scenarios. Either you have an inside job by probably a military officer from the Alawite community who will say enough is enough, and I have to worry about the future of the Alawites, not the future of the Assad family, and does a coup d'etat. I mean, that's possible. It's not likely, but I'm looking at all the sort of the scenarios. Or the international community will change its mind. We've seen that happen in Kosovo before, after it was, after a lot of killings have taken place. Or we see a change in this attitude of the Russians and the Chinese, which actually is starting to happen. Frankly, the position of Russia and China is not understood in the Arab world. And once again, Russia more than China, are actually paying a heavy price in terms of their popularity in the region after Syria. And I think are starting to understand that. The Russians were shocked to see that the reaction of Arabs was not favorable. They thought that they were standing up to the United States, standing up to the West, and that by doing so, they would have the support of Arabs. Arabs did not see it this way. They saw it as standing on the side of a regime that kills people. So I can't predict what will happen. One or a combination of this will happen. I cannot see this, rate of killing 100 people a day now, going on for an extended period of time without something giving in. But as I said, the sooner it happens, the easier the reconciliation process.
There's a lot of, you said that a lot of countries have been switching to more democracy. That's the hope and dream of a lot of people, is to have voice, be able to represent that voice. But then you mentioned something about 150 different secular parties. And it's hard. Democracy's hard. It's not you just do it and it's easy. And is that the right step to go with 150 different secular? It just seems it's hard enough just to get representation from 2 parties here, let alone 150. Is that the way to go?
It's the natural evolution of democratic processes in general. In other words, after suffering from an autocratic regime for a long time, everybody thinks they have the answers, right? I mean, everybody thinks, if it was just left to me, I would save the country. And so it's natural. If you saw what happened, for example, in Spain or Portugal in the 70s, when they made the transition to democracy after Franco died in Spain, same thing. In Spain, more than 100 parties also started contesting elections. But of course, as you said, that's unrealistic. And people will, very, very quickly find out that just because they have good ideas does not mean they have popular support necessarily. And those that end up with popular support are those who, are better organizers, are better communicators, are better, have the money, etc. So they're going to go through this. Like I said, I would expect in the next elections in Tunisia, you'll have probably 15 parties contesting, and who knows what the final number will be, 5 or 6. It certainly will be manageable. But once again, to expect people to be wise and democratic from day one, I wish things happened this way.
Different question to ask, which is about the future. And you said these things are going to take decades. My perception of the Arab world is that it's very complex and it's very diverse, but one theme that I seem to have a perception about, it has been largely a tribal society in many, many subgroups. And compared to countries which have a big urban population. And can you comment on that interplay and working out into the future, as because I don't know what the exact statistics are on people who might be considered tribal versus those who are supporting municipal and federal governments in a larger urban society.
Not all Arab societies are tribal, but certainly some of them are. The Gulf states are tribal. Jordan is tribal. Egypt is not. Tunisia is not. Even Syria is not. So you have different Arab countries with different degrees of development. And that is why you cannot treat them all the same. And that is why the pace of development, as well as its nature, will differ. There is no one-size-fits-all sort of in all Arab countries. But whether it is a tribal society or an urban one, there is a common thread that we've seen in all Arab countries in the last year, which is a demand for better governance. We've seen it in Jordan, that has a tribal society, that has a king that actually enjoys the legitimacy of his people. I mean, no one is calling for the overthrow of the monarchy in Jordan, but they are calling for a serious revisiting of the policies of the monarchy in Jordan. And we've seen it in Syria, and we've seen it in Egypt. We've seen it in tribal countries like Yemen as well. So that thread is common. I remember one Arab foreign minister on January 24 of last year, had a talk in which he said, whoever thinks Tunisia will spill over to other Arab countries does not know what they're talking about. I saw him on TV a week later, because January 25th is when Egypt started. And he said on TV, I'm serious. He said, whoever thinks Tunisia and Egypt will spill over to other Arab countries does not know what they're talking about. He's silent today. Okay? It's been 5 countries that have been toppled, well, 4 with the 5th on its way out, of different nature. It's tribal in Yemen, it's urban in Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria. It's tribal in Libya. So you've seen changes in both societies. I'll give you an example of how we try to do it in Jordan, which also has a tribal society, and where parliament is composed of individuals, each coming from, let's say, a region where he has a large tribal following, and where people are looking for that person to deliver services to them. And in such a manner, since delivering services is dependent on the state, the whole of parliament is subservient to the executive rather than the other way around. We thought of a system that would not introduce shocks to that system by changing the nature of the electoral law in a dramatic way that people are not used to. At the same time, we also wanted a system where parliament becomes political party based in the end, because that's the only way that you get organized and that parliament gets a voice, a real voice, rather than individual voices of each member of parliament. And so we proposed a system where each voter is given 2 votes. One to a district candidate and one to a national list, not to a candidate. And we thought, we can start with 90% of the votes given to a district candidate, 10% to national lists. So we don't introduce shocks. And in each election cycle, you increase the number of seats devoted to the national list at the expense of the district candidates. But you do it over 30 years. And in this way, you start with your system, but you don't end up with it. And at the same time, you put in place a gradual but a serious process. Never implemented, of course. Because once again, let's not underestimate the resilience of the status quo forces in Arab societies. These are forces that the regimes bought with favors. They bought their loyalty with favors. They don't have to give them cash, but they give them jobs, they give them education, health insurance, whatever, status. And these are people who are not ready to give this up. Because in any system that migrates from sort of what I call a rentier system to a merit-based one, these people are going to lose their privileges. I remember very, very vividly, I put it in my book, in fact, a meeting that I had, that the king had with a group representing these people in Jordan. Because I went to the king to complain. I said, Your Majesty, we're trying to, put in place a gradual reform process, but the ones against it are your own people. So he said, bring them over, bring them over, I will talk to them. And he started talking to them. One of them says, Your Majesty, we've always been with you. And we hope we will always be with you. Okay? Very, very explicit threat. But we're not with the people around you. Because the people around you are introducing a very dangerous concept. That of a merit-based system at the expense of loyalty. And I said to him at the time, you mean the two are mutually exclusive? You're either loyal or have merit. And he meant that. To him, loyalty is everything. And a merit-based system is going to rob him of his privileges. So the resilience so far has really been amazing. And when people like me argue today that, you could afford to say that in the past because the street was not moving, you cannot afford to say that because it's obvious that time is not an infinite commodity on your side. They're still resilient.
How many more? All right, we can start with you.
Doctor, I noticed that Palestine was not listed in any of the countries that have enjoyed an awakening. Can you say a few words about why not and what the prospect might be?
Yes, thanks for this question. I actually want to say more than a few words about the issue. It is actually, a sort of a mystery why we have not seen a Palestinian awakening. Of course, what do we mean by a Palestinian awakening? Because it can mean one of two things. It can be awakening against the Palestinian government. It can only mean an awakening against the occupation. The government, in fact, in Palestinian territories is rather popular these days. In other words, Salam Fayyad is a popular prime minister who has done a lot to sort of address the corruption that was in the PA before he came. And the economy in the West Bank is growing at 9% yearly today, which is, which is significant for a country or a people under occupation. So that might be one reason, I don't know. But why has there not been a Palestinian awakening against the occupation is what actually I frankly don't have an answer for. Because suppose there is one, a peaceful one, of course. I think the Palestinians would be the first to tell you today that the second intifada, which was armed, did a lot of harm to their cause. But a peaceful one against the occupation is going to be awfully difficult for Israel to address. Israel is not going to be able to shoot people for 3 months, for example. And a peace process which today is dead, it's not stagnant, in my view it's dead. Because of so many factors, no one will be able to afford to ignore it if such an awakening were to develop. What I also want to say about the issue, and I haven't addressed the issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict and its link with the Arab uprising, and it's very, in my view, very strongly linked. I think the peace process is in trouble without the Arab uprising. And this is coming from somebody who has devoted his whole career to the issue of peace. I think we are witnessing, if I want to be an optimist, I will tell you we are witnessing the near death of the two-state solution. If I want to be a realist, I will tell you the two-state solution is already dead. And it's already dead because you have, while we were negotiating the future of the West Bank and Gaza, the settlement activity did not stop. It's as if you have two people arguing over a piece of pizza whilst one of them is eating it. Doesn't work this way. You have over 500,000 settlers in the West Bank and Gaza today, including in East Jerusalem. And even if you find a solution, and we know, I mean, we have found solutions. I mean, the Palestinians and the Israelis over 20 years have actually, on their own, come up with solutions. Even if you give the part near the Green Line to Israel to take care of all the settlers there, you are left with 70 to 80,000 settlers today, dispersed all over the West Bank. Tell me what Israeli government is going to evacuate these people. Jerusalem today, East Jerusalem is totally isolated from the West Bank through the wall. Totally. What Palestinian, what Arab, what Muslim is going to accept a Palestinian state without Jerusalem, without East Jerusalem? And so if you look at the reality of the situation, saying nothing about the intentions of the present Israeli government, which in my view is not interested in a solution. We are watching a situation where it is going to be very, very difficult to implement a two-state solution. Then you have the other factor, the demographic factor. Today, in areas under Israel's control, that is Israel, West Bank, and Gaza, the number of Arabs and the number of Jews is exactly the same. Today, not 10 years from now. And I'm quoting official Israeli statistics. I'm not quoting Arab statistics. Just Google it when you go home today, the Israeli Department of Statistics, and you will see this. There are 5.8 million Jews and 5.8 million Arabs in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Which means that in 10 years' time, if we don't have a two-state solution, what is Israel going to do? What are the Palestinians going to do? If they lose all hope in a two-state solution, what is logical for them is to demand equal rights in the country they are living in. Equal rights in the country they are living in means the end of Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state. This is Israel's existential threat. It's not Iran. Iran is a radical country, but it's not a stupid country to drop a nuclear bomb on Israel. This is Israel's existential threat that nobody talks about. And all of this without even mentioning the Arab uprisings. Then come the Arab uprisings, where the emerging governments in the Arab world from now on are not going to be as soft on Israel as they were before the uprisings. If, for example, we see another war on Gaza, another war on Lebanon, they're not going to be soft. And the whole idea of a regional settlement that was put forward by the Arab Peace Initiative is an idea that nobody is looking at now. Do you think the Syrians are preoccupied with peace with Israel today? Do you think the Egyptians are occupied with this? So I worry that if we don't have a peaceful settlement today, we might face the reality that there might not be a solution in the short term to the conflict.
My question was maybe very similar, but I was going to ask, do you think the Palestinian problem had really impacted or led to the rise of political Islam? We're Egyptians, we live in Egypt, we're Christians, but we saw through the years that the Palestinian problem was the problem that always became like a commercial thing. All the leaders are trying to stay in power based on what they say.
Well, you're an Egyptian. My view, you might, I'll be interested in yours, is that political Islam was born in 1967. Because secular parties in the Arab world, which have ruled over the Arab world, led by Jamal Abdel Nasser, with his famous slogan, لا صوت يعلو فوق صوت المعركة. No voice is allowed to rise above that of the battle for Palestine. And everybody in the Arab world, not just Egyptians, everybody believed him. Or maybe some did not, but the majority of people said, yes, we will, everything else is secondary. Reform is secondary. Democracy is secondary. All our energies must be put towards the realization of the liberation of Palestine. When 67 came and the dream was shattered in 2 days, that was the birth of political Islam. People lost hope in secular nationalism, and they were looking for alternatives, and the alternative came with political Islam. That, in my view. Hamas and Hezbollah were latecomers in the 1980s, and they came about because of the, because of the special circumstances. They have an occupation in their countries. But the ideology of political Islam, which started in 1928 with Hassan al-Banna in Egypt, only acquired serious traction after 1967. That's my view.
I'm gonna, John, one quick question? Okay. He was in Tunisia with us, so he gets, I was
Okay,
gonna cut
good.
him off, but he
Good.
gets one more.
Thank you. I had a Syria question. Do you think that? My question was, you were mentioning how Russia was surprised at the Arab reaction to their support of Assad. Do you think that their continued military support and weapons sales will prop up, and also Iranian support? But I feel like Russia may have too much to lose because they're only naval based in the Mediterranean and Syria. Do you think they're going to keep the support going?
I don't think they can do this indefinitely. They certainly have the only warm water base in the region, in Tartus. But those who have argued that they don't want to lose economic sort of interest in Syria, I mean, what is Syria to Russia? I mean, what are they losing? A couple of $1 billion? I mean, that doesn't explain the Russian position. I think the Russian position can be better explained through sort of a chance to stand up to the West, through a belief that regime change should not take place in such a manner. That's the Chinese position as well. Through concern that the West might use this crisis to have a foothold in the region that is beyond the level of comfort of the Russians. I mean, these are probably explain better the Russian position rather than economic or even military interests that in the larger frame of things, I mean, Syria is small fries for Russia. But I don't think that the Russians can maintain this indefinitely. I mean, I work at a center, Carnegie, and we have a center in Russia. And I can tell you that, one, the Russians have been surprised. And two, they are looking at, their situation. What is best for them? To go on supporting a regime which most people, agree is on its way out, or to adopt a different position. And what is that different position, and how do you adopt it? I can see the Russian position changing maybe in 3 or 4 months. It's not going to be the same as that of the West. But I cannot see either the Russian or the Chinese position remaining what it is today. It's very difficult.
I'm going to have to take the opportunity, because I'm hosting this, to ask one more question. What happens if Israel bombs Iran? I know you could do the whole hour all day, but...
Again, since I'm sitting in a Christian university, I'll use a Christian expression. It will be resurrecting Iran from the dead. In other words, militarily, Iran, everybody agrees that an Israeli military strike on Iran is not going to stop Iran from acquiring a bomb. It will at best delay it by a couple of years. Two, it is not true that Israelis want Israeli public want Israel to bomb Iran. 60%, the poll came out last week, 60% of the Israeli public is against an Israeli attack on Iran. 60%. 3, politically, Iran has lost a great deal in the Arab world. 3 years ago, Ahmadinejad was the most popular leader in the Arab world, and he's not an Arab, followed by Erdogan and Bashar al-Assad. Today, the only leader that has maintained his popularity in the Arab world is Erdogan of Turkey. Bashar al-Assad and Ahmadinejad have lost big time. I'm talking polls, I'm not talking my personal opinion. Have lost big time. So this is a regime in Iran that has failed to impress or continue to impress the Arab world, that has shown itself to be on the side of dictatorships rather than on the side of democrats or the public, that has failed to govern. Many people say the Arab Spring started with the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009, again, although Iran is not an Arab country. So this is a regime on its way down. For Israel to bomb it, not achieve a stopping of the bomb, and resurrect once again Iran from the dead and make it popular once again in the Arab world, is a major, major strategic mistake, not just in military terms, but also in political ones. And I hope they don't do it, because we will all suffer as a result, including the United States.
Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.